Good morning. This is my reflection number 3. I'm going to do it in video format to address the issue of gender. I'm going to try this because this is how I can see myself doing something inside of a classroom in the future, using a keynote as a guided conversation with some multimedia embedded inside of it. So we'll see how it goes. The enduring question for this argument is going to be, how can an educator help instruct students who are gender fluid or processing their gender outside of the standard binary, so outside of the standard male-female relationship? I'm going to try to use, like I said, multimedia, but also quotes and images throughout to sort of gain attention and drive the point home. The first here is a picture of James Baldwin, who is a black man who's also a homosexual, to sort of start the conversation off about multiple perspectives or multiple intersections of a person's identification and how they identify. I think Baldwin is a really good example of that, and this could lead to an interesting conversation about hopefully deconstructing or at least challenging the idea, which I think is pretty prevalent, that there's just a lot of gay white men and women, that it doesn't span other genders or even classes. Would be something that would be interesting to explore. The objectives are hoping by the end of this and by the end of whatever conversation we have in the school to understand that people want to be understood and they want acknowledgement for their choices, their decisions, how they identify, whether that is a choice or a decision is debatable, but they want people to understand and to acknowledge it. We want to use the proper terminology to discuss and describe people's choices or decisions or non-choices, non-decisions, however it works out, and then we want to understand and change from privileging different to privileging similar. I think these are the 3 objectives to have in this conversation about gender. We'll go through this by making a couple arguments and some conclusions, but we're also going to watch some videos to see what gender is and then to explore it a little bit in depth. First, we're going to start off by talking just what gender is. That it's not male-female, it's not body parts, chromosomes, sexual orientation. It's how you identify, it's how you express yourself. I think it's really important to talk about this idea of expression. We've got the 2 drama faces. On the left-hand side, it's not expression or performance in the sense that you're putting on a show for other people. It's performance in a different capacity, in a different way, which I think is really relevant and also sometimes difficult for people to understand. We're all putting on performance now. We're performing our gender, our identity. Some people are performing their race, or the color of their skin, if race is a suspect term, performing by, like I said, the clothes we wear, but also where we live, how we live. So those are all sort of a performance of the way that we live in society. So I think this is really important and an interesting concept that needs to be explored in depth. The first video we're going to watch is an interview with the person who came up with the gender-bred man, which sort of describes gender and gender identity and helps people understand what it looks like from a different perspective. I think this is really important. We watch a little bit of the video.
What is gender and what determines it? How can someone's sex at birth, their anatomy, be different than their gender identity? I decided to get some straight talk about gender. I first saw Sam Killerman giving a TEDx talk. Sam has been studying gender for more than 10 years, and he even wrote a book about it. Sam and I met up so he could give me a lesson in Gender 101.
You use a device or a character called the genderbread man.
Person.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. The genderbread person.
It's okay. I found it really helpful to think about gender in a few different distinct categories. Gender identity, how you define your gender and how you see yourself. Gender expression, the different ways that we present or perform gender through our actions, our dress, and our demeanor. And biological sex or anatomical sex, the physical characteristics that make up our body that in many people's minds equal gender, but don't.
So, for the purpose of our discussion, the bottom line is your external genitalia does not dictate your gender.
Yeah.
Actually, for the vast majority of us, our external genitalia does correlate.
So we're going to move on from that. They sort of talk about the three aspects of the gender-bred person.
Finally tonight, a new movie opening this weekend is being widely hailed.
We're going to go ahead and pause that for right now and just wait to wrap up this conversation about the gender-bred person, where it's these three concepts of sort of the biology, the decision, and how you feel. These are three aspects to use in a classroom to help teacher and student, faculty, other staff, administration to sort of conceptualize, especially in an age group where students are struggling with or trying to figure out or understand their gender. I see it in my practicum class now where there are students who are definitely exploring their outward performance of gender, and it's very interesting and I think very important, and it's important to acknowledge that or have a pretty good conceptualization or understanding in your own mind and then be able to discuss that outwardly in a way that's not confusing or awkward or judgmental. So I think using something like the gender-bred person to have that conversation is very valuable. The next clip we're going to watch is from Moonlight. It's a conversation about the film and about a black man's young child. He grows, there's three acts as we'll see. Sort of that conversation. So we'll read it and then we'll kind of explore it a little bit further. Or I'm sorry, we'll listen and then we'll explore it a little bit further.
Finally tonight, a new movie opening this weekend is being widely hailed for its nuanced storytelling about sexual identity, race, and upbringing. Jeffrey Brown spoke with the filmmakers of Moonlight.
Who is you, Sharon?
It's a life we don't often see portrayed in commercial films. A coming-of-age tale of love and anguish. A movie that's garnered critical acclaim for the story it tells and the beauty and power of its telling. In Moonlight, we watch Chiron growing up.
At some point, you gotta decide for yourself who you're gonna be.
In the Liberty City neighborhood of Miami, as the crack epidemic is taking hold in the 1980s.
You gonna tell him why the other boys kick his ass all the time?
He is young, poor, black, and coming to terms with being gay, quietly and painfully wrestling with these identities. The story is based on the life of Terrell Alvin McCraney, who first wrote it as a play and then the screenplay for the new film.
I'm lonely.
It's a story that I still feel like I have to tell, but also that I have to explore and understand. I mean, it's a story rooted in events in my own life that I'm trying to make sense of and make sense of the world out of. And I think for me, I always am interested in trying to get a group of people to have the same conversation.
So Terrell and I grew up blocks from one another.
Director Barry Jenkins, who also grew up poor in Liberty City at the same time and with a mother fighting addiction, presents the story in 3 separate acts, using 3 different actors to play Chiron. At the new Museum of African American History and Culture, where the film was recently screened, he told me he purposely kept the actors from watching one another.
You know, one of the themes in the film for me is about the way society is shaping these young men from our communities through positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. This is what masculinity looks like. This is what it sounds like. And so much time passes between each story that I feel like the world has shaped this character into a different person. So I wanted to cast different people to play the same person, and I wanted them to be different.
We watch Chiron grow through high school, tormented by bullies and his own insecurities, living with a mother played by Naomi Harris, who sinks more and more into addiction.
What's wrong?
Nothing. I'm good.
This is a young man who speaks more loudly in his...
Okay, so we'll move on from the experience of Chiron in Moonlight. I do think a clip of a video like that in the classroom would be very important to help understand an individual. It also brings me kind of back to the debate about, but not limited to, Mohanty and Solari, this who gets to tell a story, why they get to tell it, and is just that one story good enough? I think that's important to qualify that there's gray everywhere in this conversation. Everybody's got a perspective, and not one person gets to speak for everybody. The first argument I want to make is just a general idea of understanding. I use this quote from Wes, that gender is a powerful ideological device that produces, reproduces, as legitimates the choices and limits that are predicted on sexual category. And understanding is important. It's invaluable. It affords clarity. So this idea of understanding is something that we absolutely need in a classroom, just to understand the concepts, the ideas, the people, those that are involved. The outcome then is sort of giving definitions. This is what I could do in a classroom, right? This is the actual process by which I can do something in a classroom. Getting back to the enduring question, how do I teach students using gender? I think having the genderbread person, as it's updated over and over again, is very important. I give definitions, proper definitions, understanding sexuality and understanding expression. Like, these are the things that need to be understood. These are the things that are starting to develop at a secondary classroom level. But beyond that, even in life, these are things that are fluid and moving. I think it's very important to know these kinds of things. So giving these definitions is sort of the outcome, the praxis that I can utilize in the classroom. The second argument I use is the absolute importance and power of language. Male terms used neutrally induce people to think of males. It's not just understanding the term male, female, or his story, these sort of words that get used constantly, but deconstructing them and possibly recreating them in a different way where there's more understanding about the nature of the language that we use, because it is parasitic, I think, as Multan mentions in this quote. It's takes a life of its own. It sort of sucks off the natural proclivity of the society that we live in, which is this sort of white male-dominated society. So I think understanding the language is really important. The outcome of what we can do is how we use pronouns in class, how I use external communication with students, with teachers, whether it's through a remind text, an email to a student, or just how I even process the syllabus. I also think this is very important when it comes to content presentation, making sure to bring up and talk about and really explore why gender language is used in a certain way. Really trying to understand the genderizing of society, the genderizing of many things, right? Put this picture of Facebook's gender in pronouns. I think that's interesting that this is sort of becoming a area and a thing in society that is growing in understanding and growing in presence just by being in a choice that you actually have. So that's good. A different language, but I also think understanding these languages, the use of language, but also I would call them languages, right? A different language for each type of community, and bringing that more into the mainstream is invaluable. The second argument is we live in a society, especially in the United States, but Western Europe and the sort of the West, that concept that we do privilege difference a lot. Conceptualizing the hegemonic male heterosexuality is constructed on and actively requires, this quote from Bersani says, privileging of difference. It's important in the society that we live in to privilege difference, to create this individual who can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, who is capable and generally male and white, who gets to sort of this machismo character, to use a term from another language, but it's that idea that we privilege difference, and the straight mind is privileged differently. And what I would like to do in my class is to exploit similarities. That's my argument, that it's valuable to exploit similarities and to privilege similarities. We all have things that we have in common, and they're at the most basic level. People will say that racial identity or the color of your skin are at the most base level as well, but looking at this photo by Susquehanna, you can see these are parts of different people of different races, and they're exactly the same, right? The same function, they do the same thing. So exploiting those similarities, whether it's through pop culture, societal goals, activities, or just basic humanity, doesn't take away, and I have no intention of grouping and categorizing people based off of the similarities, but I do think it's very, very important, while understanding individual difference and giving room and space, and letting other people take room in the class to be an individual, that it's very important to conceptualize we are at a certain level, a foundational nature, the same, and then we have this opportunity to grow and make choices and identify in ways that create interesting difference and uniqueness, and it's not based off of these societally contrived ideas that exist. So I think it's very important, kind of a fine line to walk, but it's becoming more clear all the time through research and then actually getting into a classroom to see the similarities that people have are also some of the things that generate this interesting concept of difference, and that it really is important and valuable to focus on, and I think doing this in a classroom is invaluable. Sort of making some connections and conclusions, I think this all gender bathroom placards is topical. We were talking about bathroom and talking about gender a lot. I also think it gives the opportunity to choose, but even these, it says all gender, which is great, but it really has male and female, which in itself is limiting. So all of the conversations, all of the identifications, everything that you create to put up for a group of people sort of takes on this either binary idea or superficialness, which is not ideal. I think it's inevitable, but at least it's generating a conversation. So the first conclusion, based off of our first idea, is that this quote from Wes as well, I think is paramount, which is society is partitioned into essential differences between men and women. Right? We do this. This exists. It's not something that we can get away from. We have to do gender because it's unavoidable. So how do we do it in a classroom? How do we let people do gender their way? How do we talk about it? How do we walk through it? How do we acknowledge it, not ignore it, not isolate, but embrace, right? I put these two side-by-side images of two very good, very famous tennis players, and the male, Roger Federer, is actively playing tennis. He's not posed in a sort of robe, shirt off the shoulder, holding a pillow, right? That's a feminine ideal that Anna Kournikova is doing on the front of Sports Illustrated. She's not participating in her sport. She is posed, actively identifying and identified by the magazine as feminine. So it's this interesting juxtaposition of male and female roles. Conclusion 2 is the words and actions we use matter, right? We have gender pronouns that are different and should be, and they should be available for students to use and should be actively encouraged by teachers to accept. It doesn't have to be, just to be encouraged, I think. It doesn't have to be pushed or idealized. I think that goes too far in a direction to become more exploitative, but presenting the options, making it clear that they're available and that you'll use them as a teacher is very important. I also really like this chart by Coloma, reading the article and talking about difference and intersectionality, gender, language, education, sexuality. These are all things that interact with each other. We're not dealing with one individually or one at a time. This is a constant and interesting idea that happens everywhere. There's nothing we can not address, right? And creating an openness for gender hopefully creates an openness for language opportunities or for racial identity, and then creates an opportunity to bring that into the classroom or to just exist inside of the classroom. so we can create more open educational opportunities. And the second conclusion is this idea of privileging similarities. I think this is something that's, I just think this is sort of the key argument of this piece is we've been so busy creating difference and constructing difference for the purposes of those that are sort of in charge, that have been the ruling populace for so long, that it takes a pretty drastic shift to start privileging similarities. And I use this quote by Mana Lanasan that talks about how migrants just aren't caretakers and mothering, right? They possess sexual desire and erotic practices. These are something, like, it's not just part of their individuality, but it's also part of their motivation. That is an understanding that people either don't want to see, have no desire to incorporate into their framework of why people do what they do, but it's very important. One, because it is part of why they do what they do, and two, it's because we all have those things, right? That is whatever the sexual desire is, most people, I will say, have some variety of it, some variety of either sexual desire, erotic fantasy, or just desire for companionship, right? There's a very social nature, and I think that is a place of privilege. The similarity is this sort of connection between the two. To bring it back to the title, I think people don't want to be a colony in a nation. This is a quote taken from Richard Nixon, which I don't get to use very often. He's talking about race relations, and blacks don't want to be a colony in a nation, but I think the quote is apt for what would be considered to be a subsection of society, right? Which I think we're all a part of. I think it goes back to the sort of graph by Coloma, and this idea that we're all in it together. We're all in, our identities are all sort of this collective pool of identities. So we're all colonies in a nation, and we don't want to be. We want to be a nation. And I think to sort of wrap this up, and the final thought is that this is what a classroom can look like. I think it's possible to bring openness and respect, to bring an understanding of language, to bring an understanding of somebody's choice and identity, and to privilege the similarities that we have over the differences that we have, to create an environment that students want to learn in, they want to participate in, and hopefully beyond that they can take outside of the classroom. Thank you.